Hey guys, afternoon. I want to do a couple of things with this video that you're going to be seeing tomorrow in class, which I guess for you watching it now is today. So basically you're watching this on Wednesday. I'm recording this Tuesday afternoon. Our conversations in our doctrines class got, I don't want to say derailed. We got led into some serious conversation about some weighty questions, some of which can be answered, and some of which don't necessarily have answers in the scripture or don't have clear enough answers for us to feel really comfortable with them in the scripture. And that's something that we kind of have to own at some point. And so I want to kind of systematize the foundation there in that setup, and then bridge that foundation and that foundational understanding into some nuance and some perspective on sin that starts to find expression in various strands of Christian tradition. Okay, so we're going to start with this. In Genesis 1 and 2, God made humanity to be his image and his likeness. And that image and likeness has moral choice, the ability to choose good or bad. And that is a reflection of the God who created us. God with his ability and his perfect character to choose what and how he does what he does. And that choice is directed and guided by God's nature and God's character. And so one of the common universal Christian understandings across all traditions in Christian thought is that God is love, because the scripture tells us that. And that means that God wills what is best for other. And so one of the questions that comes up when we start talking about this is, why would God create humanity in the first place? And one of the common Christian answers is this: because God is love, and love is compelled for the best interest of another, that God's creating is part of God's nature. It's part of his essential character, that he would create beings that he could love and that would love him in return in this free exchange of willful relationship. And so God makes humanity in his image and his likeness in order to have that relationship. And while he's at it, he establishes human beings as a go-between between the heavenly sphere and the earthly sphere. So Genesis 1 and 2, there's a pretty clear distinction between God and what God creates. There's a pretty clear distinction between the heavenly and the creation, the earthly. Humanity bridges that distance a bit. We are in his image and in his likeness, but we're dirt creatures. We are made to be like God and to reflect God, but we are among God's other creatures and his creation. We are to rule with God over God's creation by living in and among and with God's creation. And so our role is to bring creation before God and bring God before or to creation. We're supposed to sort of serve as this in-between, this mediator between what God has made and God the maker. And that's fine in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. In Genesis 3, when humanity chooses to do something that is not God's intention, that is sin, they miss the mark in a behavioral act, they have pulled apart what was supposed to be an intimate union between God and his creation. And they've strained that relationship. And because of humanity's position as ruler over what God has made, our choice has consequence for the whole of creation, not just for human beings, but for the ground and the way that the ground produces crops and plants, for the way that those things grow, and for how easy or how difficult it is. The consequence on Adam is that it's going to be difficult for the ground to produce what he wants it to produce for things like food. And so one of the things that we notice is that that the pain is never mentioned in Genesis 1 and 2. It's mentioned in Genesis 3, and only after Adam and Eve have done something they aren't supposed to do. That does not mean, however, that pain is a bad thing. It means pain is an indicator that something is not as it was intended. And this is a complex concept, but this is one that C.S. Lewis explains, I think, really, really well in a work called The Problem of Pain. And basically, C.S. Lewis says God's pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Pain is a good indication of something that has gone awry. And so pain is supposed to be the thing that reminds us and teaches us that something is not as it should be. However, while God makes use of that for good purposes and intentions, it wasn't God's design. It is a consequence of what humanity has done. And it is a continuing consequence of what has happened and is happening and will continue to happen with human beings. And this segues us into these three important strands that we need to talk about in this conversation about sin and the fallout of what has transpired. And so here we go. Number one, there is individual sin. Individual sin are the individual choices we make as individuals or as groups that are not God's design. So when we make an individual decision to cheat, to steal, to commit adultery, to fill in the blank, when we make an individual decision to do a behavior that is not God's intention, that is an individual sin. Now, those individual sins have varying degrees of consequence based on what we did and the impact that it has. And this is clear in the Mosaic Law. And it's just clear in our general relationships. The way that we handle certain things has an impact and a consequence on the people around us. And sometimes we can do something that is sin. It is to miss the mark, but it has a bigger impact and has a bigger consequence on the people around us. And so that's the first, this idea of individual. The second idea is this idea of inherited sin. And this is some of what we talked about in original sin, these first two things. Individual is the behavior of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And inherited sin is the consequence of what happens to the rest of humanity as a result of what Adam and Eve did in their original disobedience. And so inherited sin is one of those three things. It's the state, the condition, the corruption, the warping of what we are, and creates in us, it installs in us, it perpetuates in us a tendency to now choose the things that are not God's design. So because Adam and Eve chose in their individual sin to disobey, part of what they were in reflecting the image and the likeness of God becomes distorted, dysfunctional, it breaks. It's not as it was intended. And so now that they have sort of fallen from that state of original innocence, they've fallen from that status of perfect or innocent, they can't do anything other than pass on that imperfection to the next generation of human beings. And so in that regard, Adam and Eve have sort of set us all up to fail. But that is why the scripture is so clear. While Adam and Eve and their choice have set us up to fail, God has not left us alone to fail. Throughout the scripture, God makes an effort to be connected to people in covenant in order to restore what's been broken and distorted and made dysfunctional, so that while we're set up to fail by Adam and Eve, we don't have to be set up to fail in our relationships with God. He can and does continue to invest and bind himself throughout the scripture. And it seems the more the narrative moves from Genesis forward, the tighter and tighter and tighter God commits himself to groups of people. And so he commits himself to Abraham, and Abraham goofs it up. And when he does, and Abraham sins, and he messes it up because of his individual choices and because of his tendency to sin, God insists that he is still going to partner with Abraham and Abraham's family. And that is the same story as God's partnership and relationship with Israel. And so what we're looking at in the scripture is not a God who has said, okay, you messed up, and Adam and Eve sort of messed it all up for you, and now you're sort of playing shorthanded. He doesn't leave us there to continue playing shorthanded. He joins us in relationship and insists that we continue to try to have good, right, united relationship with God. And he provides the solution to what that needs to look like at every step of the way. And so he institutes covenants, and he says, this is the sign of the covenant, participate. And he institutes the law, and he says, hey, look, because you don't always understand, because you're not always in the know, these are the things that I need you to not do. And then he provides a way when we mess up to be forgiven. And then ultimately we lead up to Jesus, who's the last fulfillment of all of what that has been leading us to. And that's necessary because of the progress of human history. It's necessary because this is how God established it. It's necessary because Scripture says without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. And we see God then provide us with a vehicle by which to have forgiveness and to restore right relationship with God. He gives it in the sacrificial system. In Adam and Eve's case, God gives them garments of animal skin, which means God's made the sacrifice of the animal on their behalf and has now provided them with the coverings that they need because of their new state of existence in their relationship with each other and with God. But there are consequences. Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, and they're cut off from the tree of life. The last of these three pieces, so we have individual sin, we have inherited sin, we've covered those two. The last of them is this idea of imputed sin. And imputed sin can be a bit complicated, and it can be a bit tenuous, and it can be challenging. And so I want to lay out imputed sin in a parallel manner to the way the scripture lays out a particular argument about Jesus. So it works like this. Imputed sin is sin that is credited to us. So Adam and Eve sinned because Adam and Eve are the whole of humanity. And because they are the head of the human race, in Adam and Eve, all of humanity sinned. And here's the parallel. When Hebrews is arguing for Jesus' high priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, he makes an argument that Abraham paid a tithe to a priest in the Old Testament whose name is Melchizedek. And because Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek blessed Abraham, the Levites, who are Abraham's descendants, and in Abraham, also tithed to Melchizedek through their ancestor. And so the argument for imputed sin works a lot like that. If the Levites tithe through their ancestor Abraham to Melchizedek, making Melchizedek greater than Abraham and the Levite, then in a way, humanity sins through Adam and Eve because they're the whole of the human race and because they're the two who are the ancestors that start us on this trajectory. And that is not necessarily our fault, but it is our condition. And so the line between inherited sin, sometimes called imparted, and the line between that and imputed can get a little fuzzy. And it can get hard to distinguish between the two. Basically this: Adam and Eve give us the tendency, the corruption, or the state wherein we are inclined to sin all the time. Based on the way some of the arguments work in the scripture, and based on the way Romans 5 works in the scripture, there are some groups of Christians who will make an argument that humanity is imputed the original sin of Adam and Eve, because the whole human race is contained in Adam and Eve, both in the fact that they're the only two humans, and in that idea of lineage. And since all of us came to a culminating point in Adam and Eve, then when they sinned, the whole of humanity also sinned. And that means that we, in certain Christian strains, can be counted sinners. We will sin. We have a broken image, a corrupted nature, a state that is not original innocence or grace. And so we are because we sin. We are because our pure image and mirror for the reflecting of God's character and likeness is broken and distorted. And we are sinners because in our ancestral parents, humanity sins. And so what it effectively amounts to is this. The scripture takes up a position that says human beings sin. Because we do. Human beings sin because Adam and Eve sinned. Human beings sin because we have sin. That's kind of the end run of it all. Well, I'll do it this way. I'm really comfortable with the ideas in the scripture of individual sin and inherited sin. Adam and Eve made a choice. That's their individual sin. Adam and Eve gave us something that is now dysfunctional, broken, distorted, not as it was intended to be. And so we are inclined to repeat their individual mistakes and make the same sets of mistakes. Imputed sin is a bit more complicated for me. I understand the argument, like the Levites paid tithe through Abraham to Melchizedek. All humanity sinned through Adam and Eve because of ancestry. I understand that argument. I understand how that argument is made in Hebrews in relationship to Jesus being greater than the Levites because of the Levites paying tithe through Abraham to Melchizedek. And I understand how individuals can take Romans chapter 5 and through Adam, sin comes to all, and talk about this idea of imputed sin from Adam and Eve. It doesn't make me comfortable with it, though. I struggle with that, and I struggle being comfortable with that. I'm not sure how, I'm not quite sure how to get my head around it completely. However, like individual choice and the inherited tendency to sin, imputed sin is resolved in Jesus. And imputed sin would be resolved in that salvation because God has always solved our problem with sin. Adam and Eve made the mess, and we are all living in the consequences of that mess. But God has not left us alone to wallow in those consequences. We now have choice, like Adam and Eve had choice. And the choice is the same that Adam and Eve had. We will either choose to rightly partner with God or not. We will either choose to rightly partner with God and be made into the image that we are supposed to be, or not. And those are kind of our choices. God made human beings with choice, with a free will, because God has a free will. And this is part of what it is to be in the image and the likeness of God. God is love and expresses that love by creating beings who can freely love him in return. But God will not force choice or non-existence on any of his created things. He will let us make our choice. And when our time in this life has reached its end, our choice, based on the testimony of Scripture, will be finalized, and we will live for eternity with that choice. I think the reason that's the case, and the reason that's the presentation of the Scripture, is because God chose to make humanity as beings who, once they start, do not end. So we are creatures who have a starting point, but we do not have an ending point. And as such, our decisions resonate because we're not just temporal, we're eternal, we're infinite. We have a start, we do not have an end. And that is part of the problem with sin. When Adam and Eve sin in the garden, or when you and I sin now, it's not just a temporal choice. It has an eternal, an infinite ramification to it, because we're not just temporal beings. Why did God choose to make us that particular way? Because it seems that is how beings with a free will genuinely have that free will, and genuinely can express that free will in being purposefully and voluntarily, eternally, rightly related with God. A lot of the why questions, unfortunately, the Scripture doesn't give us an answer to. And we're told what, and we're told how, if we can get our heads completely around the how. But the Scripture, and God in the Scripture especially, has a tendency to not answer why. And sometimes it's the why questions are approached with some measure of gentleness, and God just sort of ushers us to something different. And sometimes the why questions are met with, sometimes it's not ours to know, and sometimes it's ours to reconcile the what and the how with what we're going to do now. And so while we're inclined to ask the why question, when we don't get answers to the why questions, we have two choices. We can continue to ask the why question and get frustrated, even though there may not be an answer for it. Or we can ask, what now? And what now is sort of where we're headed this week as we talk about sin. So we have three types when it comes to sin, three categories, three avenues that we see sin talked about, discussed, and expressed in the Scripture, and echoed in Christian traditions. Christian traditions will talk about individual sin. We all make choices. Inherited sin. We all get something from Adam and Eve in this inheritance, in this passing down. And what we get is broken and distorted and not as God intended. And so we repeat their mistakes. We continue to make choices that are sinful. And the third is imputed. One way to look at the imputed is in Adam and Eve, all humanity sinned because all humanity was summed up in Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And that is now the state of humanity. And so that's where we're at. God has resolved that on our behalf. And that is where we're headed with a conversation that we're getting into tail end of this week and beginning of next, which is salvation. If this is the human problem and humanity has created it, but God solves it, how does God solve it? See you guys.